This is our latest COVID-19 special episode with Daniel Wagner, up next on the All Things Risk podcast. Welcome back to the All Things Risk podcast. I'm Ben Catania, your host. This is my show where we go long form on risk and uncertainty. 3 weeks ago, we released a special update on COVID-19 with an emphasis on what's happening geopolitically, what we can expect, and broader big picture implications. And we did that with Daniel Wagner, our guest. He is a country risk expert and author. He's been on the show many times. And the show proved to be a very popular episode. And I think the reason for that is because there's just a lack of meaningful, balanced, big picture analysis about what's going on. And Daniel provides that perfectly. So he and I thought, look, let's do this again. This thing is evolving and we should check in every now and then and see what's going on and what it means. So we did exactly that. And this episode is the result of that conversation. It was recorded on the 18th of April, 2020, and we're releasing it on the 21st of April. It's very insightful, as are all our conversations with Daniel. So let's get right into it. Let's talk COVID-19. Here's Daniel Wagner. Daniel, welcome back. It's been a few weeks ago, but it seems like it's been a long time because this is the month of May or something like that. It just feels like one day, kind of folds into another. So we are in this thing and it feels like we've been in it for a while and it feels like we'll continue to be in it for an even longer while.
I totally agree. 3 weeks seems to me like it might as well be 3 months. And soon enough, I suppose we could say it would be 3 years. Let's hope it doesn't get to that.
Let's hope so. Well, let's talk about what's happening perhaps in our respective geographies a little bit. And maybe we can compare some notes. Here in the UK, of course, Boris Johnson was hospitalized with the coronavirus and has gotten out. And we seem to be seeing a flattening of the curve, which is good. But I was looking at some statistics today and we have tested only 0.5% of our population, and it's among the lowest of all OECD countries. And it's quite shocking.
I wish we could say we've tested, 0.5% of our population. We aren't even coming close. I mean, one of the travesties in America, for those who aren't following it or aren't living here, which is where I'm talking to you from, again, in Connecticut, is that we've just gotten the testing thing completely wrong. And part of what makes this such a travesty is that so much of the pain that is being felt now was completely avoidable. Let me even take you back 3 separate administrations ago. Back in 2004, George W. Bush started a biodefense program. He allocated something like $5.5 billion toward it. It was designed to make the government response more robust, to purchase masks and PPEs and things like that. And what ended up happening was the U.S. did indeed get a lot of that stuff in their supply. And what ended up happening was that in 2009, we had an outbreak of H1N1 flu here. And that depleted something like 3/4 of our N95 masks and related items. And it wasn't replenished. So when Trump points the finger at previous administrations for not getting some things right, he's actually right. I mean, George W. Bush, Obama, even Trump, they've all had initiatives in the biodefense arena. And they all had an opportunity to get this right. But the last 2 administrations, including this one, simply have not. So we ran out of N95s. It wasn't then replenished. And even though we had, as we know, months of advance notice that this thing was coming to our shores starting in January. The Trump administration did virtually nothing. And the testing situation here now is abominable. You have to wait 2 weeks to get a result. There are a few drive-up options in a few states, but mostly you have to have a doctor's note. You can't get it otherwise, and you have to wait 2 weeks for your results. I mean, that's the period of time that you're sitting there in quarantine. So I find myself wondering, what's the point of even bothering testing?
That's crazy. And going back to the previous administrations and then the advanced warning that the whole world got, what do you attribute that to, that we did nothing, that most governments just waited? Is it a recency bias thing, the fact that you had Southeast Asian and East Asian countries like South Korea reacting quickly, that they had the SARS recency bias that played in their favor, and we hadn't seen this before in that scale in the United States and Western Europe? What are the factors in your view?
Well, ultimately it boils down to denial and lack of preparedness. I mean, for Trump to have sat there in the case of the US in January, basically saying, we've had 5 cases and it's going to go down to 0. I mean, that's just an imbecilic statement. With everything else that was going on, how could he possibly say something like that? When you have a leadership that's in that much in denial, what do you do with it? I mean, what kind of instructions is a person like that likely to give the government to do a better job? Now, come March, when they really understood what was going on, they did appoint Vice President Pence, but what they really should have done is they should have appointed someone who was actually totally prepared for something like that, someone who's actually a doctor or a virologist or somebody who can do a much better job of doing what's going to be necessary. I mean, it sort of shocked everybody here that he did that. Those of us who don't particularly care for the president, it's shocked. For the people who are in his camp, I think they thought, well, that was a perfectly logical move. But you're right that the Asians had plenty of practice to get this thing right. Let's not forget that China is the point of origination for the following viruses over the last 50 or 60 years. It is the Asian flu of 1957, the Hong Kong flu of 68, the Russian flu, which despite its name, the first cases actually originated in China, the 99 H5N1, the 2000, then there was SARS, then the 2009 H1N1, and on and on and on. I mean, the idea that this originated in China should have been a surprise to nobody. But knowing all of this, you go back that far in history, this is not a new phenomenon. What's new is that it's hit our shores and the global community with such veracity, and very, very few governments, particularly outside of Asia, had any realistic way of being prepared for this thing, either because of lack of resources, lack of planning, or they just don't get it.
And when I look at things like, I'm very curious about the sort of end of year, top risks of 2020. The World Economic Forum puts out these things. All of the major risk consultancies do the same. I'm not sure how many had pandemic on there.
Yeah, some would have had pandemic on there. For example, the last time we spoke, I mentioned the city's risk index with Lloyd and Cambridge.
Correct.
And, there is some planning in place. And certainly anybody who has any kind of radar would have understood that this is something that needs to be on their plate. But in the absence of having a really immediate or near-term problem, most governments are never going to get it right.
So the last time we talked about the WHO and how it praised China for its response in spite of what happened initially, in spite of the history that you just laid out. And we've also in the past talked at length about China's influence over multilateral institutions like the WHO. And since we spoke, President Trump has announced that he is withdrawing funding from the WHO as a form of punishment and a political scapegoat, as many would argue, and it does certainly look like that. What do you make of that? And shouldn't the U.S. also take some blame for not being awake to the threat of what was going on in these multilateral institutions so that they could function more effectively?
Yeah, I totally agree with that latter comment. As we've discussed, I think, before, China's masterful at being stealthy about really having outsized influence in these multilateral institutions, particularly when you consider the amount of funding that they provide. In the case of the WHO, the U.S. provides about 15% of its funding. It's a budget of $6 billion or so. By contrast, the UK provides about 7%, and China provides 0.2% of funding, and that's after having increased it substantially in recent years. So you do find yourself wondering, how is it that China could have such oversized influence in this kind of an institution? And we go back to the discussion we had 3 weeks ago, where I was, I believe, mentioning that Tedros is Ethiopian. Ethiopia is a Marxist government. They have a very tight relationship with China. China is building an African CDC in Addis Ababa, et cetera, et cetera. Tedros didn't want to upset the Chinese for a variety of reasons. And you end up with something like that, and add to it, there was a 2017 Chatham House report, which basically fingered the WHO in a number of areas. Apart from being obviously politicized, they were talking about how bureaucratic and unprepared and unwilling to take risks in terms of getting things right. And this is a disease, if you will, that many multilaterals have, many public sector institutions have, where the people that are inside, their jobs are safe. They can only be fired for committing murder, if even that. And that really doesn't incentivize them very much to take risks and think outside of the box. But of course, if there is an institution that needs to do that, it is the WHO. Now, I have to believe that the WHO needs to be reformed in a significant way, but this is really not the time to do it. So Trump was doing what Trump does, which is go for the jugular at exactly the most vulnerable time on any given subject and try to get the most political bang for the buck. And he was doing all that stuff, doing this. We're shooting ourselves in the foot at the same time by doing that, because the WHO does very important work. This is not the right time to chop their legs off. And I don't know exactly even if Trump has the ability to do that, because that was congressionally mandated funding. So I think there's a political fight here on that front. But at the end of the day, what will happen if all of this goes through? What will happen is we are criticizing China for having undue influence in the WHO, and China is likely to come in and pick up the gap that we're leaving behind on funding. So how does that help things?
And as discussed, the cause of that is the withdrawal of the U.S. and possibly allies, but certainly the U.S. from these institutions in terms of decision making and getting involved in what they're all about. So the withdrawal of the U.S. and its kind of shirking multilateralism certainly hasn't helped.
And this, of course, is exactly what happened with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? We pulled out when Trump came in, and the Chinese swooped right in and they picked up where we left off, and the TPP went ahead. And guess who wasn't on that train? The United States.
Right. Well, it's also very interesting to see what's happening domestically. And I suppose you could argue, as I think about Trump's actions, I think his audience is a domestic audience. Be very curious what your response to that is. But I see these protests happening in different states to end lockdowns. And it seems to me that what Trump is doing is just trying to set himself up, obviously, for his re-election running, so that you've got scapegoats in strategic places, the WHO, China, and the Democrats in various states for whatever condition the economy and the U.S. happens to be in come November.
Well, let's not forget also that by saying that it's up to the governors and the mayors to pass laws and proclamations, he's basically then letting himself off the hook. But it is the case that the Constitution here actually provides for that. So it's very convenient for him in that regard. The whole thing is totally politicized. I frankly don't understand this new movement over here with all these people who want to say, I'm not going to stay at home anymore. It's about freedom. It's about liberty. What it really is about is self-gratification, if you ask me, and a lack of orientation toward the common good. So I think it's very easy for these people and for the Trump administration to say, yes, this can't go on forever. We need to put America back to work. And yet it's happening at the same time where we are seeing in the places where they have started to lift restrictions, namely China and also South Korea and other places like Singapore, where they're finding, really significant new areas of infection. And then I read just today that both in China and in South Korea, they're finding rates of reinfection among people who had previously graduated from this thing. So that says to me that ultimately there's really only two answers. One is that you have a treatment. The other is that you have some sort of a vaccine. Now, as I think I might have mentioned before, if you look at Ebola and HIV and SARS, even the common cold, we don't have vaccines for any of those things. So it seems to me to be unrealistic. Now, I'm not a virologist or an epidemiologist or a doctor, but common sense tells me that being the case, it seems really unrealistic to imagine that we're going to have a vaccine in the space even of 12 to 18 months. Vaccines typically take 10 or 20 years to develop. If we were able to do that in 18 months, it would be some kind of a miracle. And even if that were the case, how long would it take to vaccinate the entire world? It'd probably take another 18 months. So at a minimum, it seems to me, in a test case scenario, we're looking at 3 years of this thing going on.
And as you describe that and thinking about it, what we really need to be doing, it seems to me, is lots of testing and tracing and isolation of cases, and particularly at ports and airports and these kinds of things. And I imagine, there'll be continued restrictions on mass gatherings and concerts, sporting events, all of those kinds of things.
I think it's going to be some time until we go back to any semblance of normality. I've been reading some predictions from scientists that suggest that it could go on for a minimum of 5 years for just the reasons that I was talking about before. But I think what we're likelier to have is some sort of a treatment. Now, there was yesterday, there was some news in the States about a company called Gilead, which has had some very favorable results from a treatment that they had for Ebola that seems to have helped, the most difficult patients. That's great. We should bear in mind, even in that case, with that particular drug, which I think is called Remdesivir, they had developed this for Ebola 15 years ago. It never got approved. It was never fully effective. So what do we do here? Even if you end up with some sort of a vaccine and they mass produce it, that vaccine is more than likely to go to the first responders and the emergency workers, first and foremost, maybe even exclusively, in the absence of being able to mass produce it in the billions, which would be necessary. There's also something that I think is very interesting that's been going on, and that is I've been watching some video reports from some very eminent scientists, some of whom are suggesting that what we should really be doing is basically let everyone get sick and try to develop a herd immunity. And if we can do that, then that might be our best opportunity to fight this thing. And what you do in the interim is you take the most vulnerable populations, the ill and the aged, you segment them, let everybody else basically go back to it, work their way through this, mindful that some 80% of infections are relatively mild, and that most people will actually recover without any medical intervention whatsoever. So I think that actually makes a lot of sense. If you say that to people, they'll think you're crazy, or they'll think you don't have a shred of humanity in your bones. But we have to be practical now. At the end of the day, what are we going to do? Are we going to simply print money for the next 5 years? Are we going to provide endless amounts of handouts? How many businesses even then would be saved? there are going to be millions of businesses around the world that are simply going to fail. And if you believe in free market economics, you would say, well, I guess that's the way it has to be. We're looking here in the States at the $2.2 trillion that's already been allocated for this thing. We ran out of the small business loans that were allocated within that 2.2 billion, something like 350 billion. We ran out of that this past week, which means Congress has to allocate more, and then it just seems like it's going to be an endless gravy train. You run out, you print more, you run out, you print more. I don't see how that's sustainable. And I think it would be a terrible legacy to be leaving behind to our grandchildren and maybe even great-grandchildren about who's actually going to pay for this when it's all over. So it could be that it's just one of those things where it's going to kill a lot of people and we're just going to have to live with it and move on.
Well, the UK started with the herd immunity strategy and then did a dramatic 180 on it because it would, at least in the short term, lead to a dramatic spike in cases beyond which the healthcare could cope. So it's interesting. I'm not sold on it. I think that if one's going to do that, then we need at least massive amounts of antibody tests to know who's had it and who therefore already has the immunity. And that figure may be a lot higher than we know. There just hasn't been enough testing. As well as all of the other measures that you talked about in terms of safeguarding the most vulnerable. But it's, I think, a combination of things. So maybe it's a bit of that. Maybe it's a bit of, or a lot of testing, certainly a lot more than we have now. And maybe there are some treatments available. The more time that we have to develop those things, the better. But of course, we're seeing lots of pressure. And we haven't talked a lot about the economics of this as well. People businesses going bankrupt, particularly small businesses, and sooner or later, there will be this sort of groundswell of bottom-up pressure in a variety of countries and economies.
So part of my response to that, Ben, would be to ask a basic question, which is, once the existing healthcare options have been exhausted, the hospital beds are full, there are no more ventilators, et cetera. It seems to me that those people who are going to get sick might as well have been in a situation of developing herd immunity to begin with, because there will be no more hospital beds and ventilators. I can tell you, being just down the road from New York City, where they've been inundated, where they've been having 600 or 700 deaths a day, where they've pretty much been full up. We're already in that sort of situation, and certainly it's not going to be long in this country before we're going to find rural areas, smaller cities, they're going to be overwhelmed very, very quickly. So I guess you have to say it's a question of relative weights. There's no way that everybody who's going to get ill from this thing, seriously ill, is going to have a hospital bed and a ventilator. So on that basis, would we be dumb not to try to develop herd immunity? The other thing is, and you were talking about antibody testing, there is no clear evidence that, first of all, you can adequately test for antibodies that are going to mean anything. And secondly, that you can test the number of people for antibodies who would need to be tested for it to try to develop some sort of a strategy to let people start going back to work, et cetera. I don't know how that's going to work with reinfections happening, with such inadequate testing procedures here and around the world. I mean, think about Africa. You can't get a bar of soap in some places in Africa. How are they possibly going to be able to cope with this and some other places in the developing world? It's a terrible problem we've got on our hands. And I suppose that we simply have to recognize that there is going to be a pandemic every 50 or 100 years, whatever it might be. We're always going to be underprepared. There are always going to be too many deaths, too much economic pain, et cetera. And there's very little at the end of the day, in the absence of a treatment or a vaccine, that anybody can do.
It's a sobering thought. But it's one that touches on the relationship between humans and nature, and maybe it's our hubris that we can control nature, that leads us to all types of risks that occur. And maybe it's another one where we go back to your Anthropocene era and the stance you've taken around global risk agility and these kinds of things, that we need to look at our relationship with nature in a different way.
We do. It's certainly an invitation to start doing that. I hope that's the case, Ben. My concern is that every time we have a major crisis, whether it's financial or science-related or health-related, people have short memories. They remember for a year or two, and then all of a sudden it's like we're moving on to the next thing. And a perfect example is where we are vis-a-vis the economic crisis of the Great Recession. It seems like a distant memory to so many people. And now we're in an economic situation that really makes the Great Recession look like an appetizer. And so you have to ask yourself, on orders of magnitude, everything that was done, it wasn't a waste of time to do it. Certainly the banking sector in America and around the world is stronger than it was. It's strong enough so far to weather this, but we haven't seen the bad loans coming in yet. We haven't seen the wave of bankruptcies coming in yet. And when that happens, I'm very, very concerned about what that's going to mean for the national and global economy. But it also goes to point further to what you were talking about just now, that I rather doubt that getting our relationship right with Mother Nature is going to be at the front of the line. Unfortunately, I think it's just going to get kicked down the road further and further.
And this is where it starts to get a little bit, I get angry, to be honest, that we don't look at these things and say, hey, wait a minute, we've got a few things wrong and we have actually an opportunity to make some changes. And I don't know about you, but whenever I've had a kind of a personal crisis or problem, there's always an opportunity for growth there and to change certain things. And when you think about, wet markets in and around the world and the trade in endangered wildlife and all of these things, you wonder, well, why aren't we thinking about stopping those things at least, so that we don't get another one of these? We minimize the chances of getting another one of these.
Well, this certainly is a reminder that Mother Nature is the ultimate boss. And I'm glad that our environment is getting a bit of a rest. We've seen it all from the satellite photos of before and after, 2 months later after this thing is broken out. It is a reminder that, from New Delhi, you can actually see the Himalayas if there is no air pollution around. It's amazing that we've even gotten an opportunity to do that again. I thought I'd never in my lifetime would I be able to say that. But I want to speak for a minute on a related topic, and that is the speculation that's been going on in the Western press about to what extent this virus originated in a wet market in Wuhan or whether it was man-made.
Okay.
What I've done since we last spoke is I've actually written a new chapter for my book, The America-China Divide, that is going to be released as of Monday or Tuesday, at least the print and Kindle versions. The audio version will come sometime in May. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I did a lot of research on some of these things, and I found out some very interesting tidbits, which I want to share with the audience. One is that back in November and December, the Wuhan Institute of Virology was publishing job openings for scientists who could work on bat viruses. Mm-hmm. And it just so happens that since 2012, the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the Wuhan CDC have been doing a lot of research on bat viruses, and they discovered something like 2,000 new viruses over much of the last decade. Now, also worth noting that there's only one, what they call BSL Biosafety Lab 4 level, which is the most secure level of laboratory in China. It's in Wuhan. There's a specific scientist who had been actively working on bat viruses. He wasn't the only one, of course, but he was leading some of the efforts. His name is Tian. And one of the reports that I read noted that he had gotten in direct contact with bat urine because he didn't have the proper protection on for one of his forays into the bat caves. And there is speculation that he or another one of the scientists might have been the actual first victim of this thing sometime back in November or December. That part is speculation. But what is not speculation is that China has been actively working on bat viruses for many years now. And there were two studies, Western studies, one in 2013 and one in 2017, that established a direct link between bats and humans, meaning there was nothing in the middle. There was no other animal host. That seems to be very well established now. And a lot of the research that went on in what they call BSL-2 labs, which are not nearly as secure as the BSL-4 labs. So there's speculation that this could have escaped either through one of the scientists or through some breach in the security into the general population, and it didn't need an animal host. In fact, most of the initial cases that occurred in Wuhan had no link whatsoever to the seafood market, which has been fingered in so many of these reports. So, and then of course, well, here we are in April, and just a week or so ago, many of these seafood markets, live animal markets, have opened up again in China. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Astonishing, right? Mm-hmm. I'm just blown away by this, that the Chinese government would allow that to happen. So anyway, some of the interesting things that I've researched in the last few weeks, and I've found it fascinating, but it also makes me believe more than I had, wondered before, whether there was actually a likely leak from a scientific lab in the Wuhan or other areas. There, by the way, the horseshoe bat, which is believed to have been the host for this thing originally, that is not native to Wuhan, and they don't sell bats in a seafood market. So discuss.
Right. So according to this theory, then the virus didn't migrate from a bat to a pangolin. So this is not something that occurred in one of these traditional Chinese medicine markets where pangolin scales were purchased and then somehow consumed, etc. So this is a different. This is a theory that offers something that's different. Because pangolins, as far as I understand, are things that are quite popular in traditional Chinese medicine, or pangolin scales are used in traditional Chinese medicine.
Correct. And there was a very noteworthy New York Times report in the past week that noted that there were some people who were very concerned about what was going on in these labs in the U.S. government, and they had been raising the flag back several years ago, and it seems to have been ignored or not sufficiently paid attention to. But this is not a new concern. This is an existing concern from the U.S. and other governments, and it hasn't been as widely reported in the media. But the more I read, the more it raises my eyebrows, I can tell you that.
Sure. And I suppose that as these experiments have occurred and as things like these wet markets are opened up again, as you say, it's only a matter of time before the next one, and maybe the next one will be sooner rather than later. I mean, can you imagine in, say, 2 to 3 years, something else comes up that that compounds the problem?
Wouldn't surprise me at all. And of course, with our difficult time getting any kind of transparency or sense of being upfront by the Chinese government, you do have to wonder how much of what they say could actually possibly be true. I mean, think about it. I've been following the numbers of infections around the world. And interestingly enough, after the Chinese infection rate hit about 83,000, and after their death rate hit something like 3,300, they flatlined. This makes absolutely no sense. I mean, these rates of infection and death are growing at an exponential rate virtually everywhere else in the world. But you're trying to tell me that the epicenter of this thing in China just flatlined and it hasn't grown in weeks? Makes no sense.
It doesn't make sense because you would expect the growth to mirror what's happening elsewhere in terms of the curve, and they've started to open up their economy again,
or at least be somewhat similar. I mean, in fairness, the Chinese government deserves credit for its draconian response, as only it can do. It's got miners in every village and a drone over every house and the AI and everything else they can throw at this thing. Well, good for them. I mean, it actually comes in very handy in a situation like this. And it also gives fodder for the people who suggest that an authoritarian form of government might actually be preferable on any number of areas. And in a situation like this, it's hard to argue against that, to be honest. So I don't know where that leaves us here. We need to have China on board in the WHO with their resources to help us craft some sort of a meaningful, collective, global response. And of course, the situation between America and China really could not be worse. It hasn't been this bad since the 1960s and the Mao era.
Right. And I presume it's only going to get much worse as we head into the elections.
Yeah, that would also be my guess. I don't see how it gets better, Ben. I mean, even if there is a new president in January here, I don't know that America is likely to shift course. I mean, it seems to be, after 4 years of this kind of approach, it seems to be pretty much ingrained at this point. And I think most lawmakers and most of the people here are sort of used to thinking of China as, the great enemy, sort of like we were conditioned to believe for decades with the Soviet Union. So where do we go from here? I don't see how it's going to get much better anytime soon.
Yeah. As a non-American, one of the things, and it sounds very simplistic, but it always seems like the United States needs an enemy of some kind, whether that's Islamic extremism, the Soviet Union, and so forth. You need an enemy. So China's
that's pretty much
role.
Ingrained in our culture and our psyche, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I wonder where this thing goes from here, and what do you think the next few months will look like?
I think it's slowly going to get better in terms of response globally and certainly in the U.S. It has to. It's hard to imagine that it's going to stay this bad indefinitely. Interestingly enough, there have been reports here that the U.S. government has actually been competing with the states to get N95 masks and PPE and all that sort of thing. And it's just mind-boggling to me that we don't have some sort of a better way of melding together public and private resources. That's another advantage that China has in spades. I would like to believe that eventually the Trump administration is going to get the formula somewhat right, at least, and that the states are going to be more successful in procuring PPE and other equipment from sources outside the U.S., because that's pretty much where it's been coming from. And I've got to believe also that eventually there will be, probably over the summer, some sort of a middle ground where some businesses will be able to slowly reopen. Consumers will gradually start going back. I just visited a restaurant today to get some takeout. There was nobody there. I don't know how these restaurants can even stay in business for much longer. But that being the case, knowing what kind of a body blow the collective public globally has taken to this thing, are they all of a sudden going to be going to sporting events and restaurants and concerts and malls to the extent that there are even going to be any malls left that haven't gone bankrupt after this thing goes on for months and months? I think it's an assumption that if the government was to open the floodgates, that everybody would simply go back to normal, and I don't see that happening.
Right. People are going to change their behaviors, no doubt.
And nobody likes what we're having to go through, but on the other hand, it really focuses the mind and brings us back to fundamentals, which is your health, your family, your friends. Those are the things that matter. And at the end of the day, I'm hoping that it's going to result in some sort of collective therapy, if you will, in terms of people saying, this has really helped me focus my mind. I just spoke to a friend of mine who's stuck in Yangon in Myanmar. He can't get out. He wanted to come back, but he can't come out. And he's using this time actually for a spiritual reset. He's reading a lot in spirituality. He's practicing it. He's going back to some fundamentals that I suspect he hasn't visited in many years, if at all, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the sort of response that a lot of people are going to have.
I think a lot of people are having that response, and out of necessity, out of lack of choice, out of all of these kinds of things. Of course, you can pretty much watch any film that's ever been produced in the world, and there are all kinds of entertainment options that exist now in your home that haven't even just a few short years ago. But I agree. I think that this is an opportunity for a bit of a pause and to sit down and kind of question who we are and as individuals, and I suppose collectively. And maybe there's also a bit of amongst some, a sense that we perhaps need to think collectively a little bit more than individually. I don't know how long that will last or stay, but that feeling that what I do can affect many other people and vice versa.
It is worth pointing out, I'm sure it's the case there as it is here, that there's been tremendous outpouring of common good, common humanity in terms of people volunteering their time and making extra effort to try to do something good or valuable to someone else. That's human nature, right? Mm-hmm. And just as survival instinct is human nature as well. So it would be wonderful from my perspective if this did result in some sort of a, if you will, come to Jesus moment where everybody basically said, time to reappraise what's really important and where we go from here.
I think we shouldn't dismiss that as a possibility. I think as risk professionals, you and I sometimes look at the darker side of things, as we must, but there are some upsides and perhaps some different ways in which to reshape our institutions and the way in which we're governed. It's good to hope, right?
You got to have hope, my friend. Otherwise, what is there?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the other side of this, I've also noticed a little bit of a pushback around all the sort of self-improvement and this sort of ethos of productivity, and that we are all machines, and a range of these kinds of things, a sort of utilitarian view of human nature. And that's interesting, because if you look at certainly countries like the United States, but Western Europe as well, there's a lot of that ethos that's built into the way in which our countries are set up, but particularly in the United States. The economy's got to open, we've got to all be working and producing, and maybe not.
I do wonder if we had a different leader here in America at this particular juncture, how different things would be, both on a preparedness level and in terms of the messaging that is being delivered to the American people. And I have to say, it has been absolutely atrocious from this administration. I think, for instance, if there was a Biden who was in power at this juncture, or an Obama, I'm not saying that because they're Democrats, just because these are decent people who have clearly a different way that they would be governing. I've got to think that it would have been so much easier to rally around the flag, around the collective good, around what needs to be done. Don't forget, it wasn't too many generations ago where we had Rosie the Riveter and everyone was dropping what they're doing to make items for the war effort, and they were willing to bear personal sacrifice on a grand scale. You don't get the sense from this administration that that's what they're wanting people to do. What they seem to be wanting people to do is do what you need to do to take care of you, and let's get back to work as quickly as possible, period.
Mm-hmm. I'll go a step further. If you look at some of the countries that have performed quite well